The utility company, Exelon, that runs Conowingo currently had to renew its license, and the state of Maryland said before you renew your license, and they had to give approval, we'd like several studies to be done because, as you know, the state of Maryland is required by federal agencies, the EPA, to clean up parts of the bay, and there's this pollution diet, it's called, where they look at the total maximal daily loads, how much is allowed to come in of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediments. And you know, the Conowingo Dam has done a great job for many years of catching the sediments coming down from the Susquehanna, and you know, when we thought it was a bottomless pit, but it's filled up behind the dam, and now it's almost in equilibrium. It isn't the storage vehicle that it once was, and we get high river flow, high rainfall events, storms, and when they open the floodgates to reduce the pressure behind the dam, this material that's been stored there, you know, scours out and comes down the bay. And so as we presented it to the state and presented it to Exelon, we really need to know three things. What's behind the dam in terms of nitrogen, phosphorus, sediments, and not just what's behind the dam, but how reactive is it when it comes over the dam, what effect it's going to have. The second question is how much is going to come over under different conditions? You know, when you have another Isabel or another Agnes, you know, what's going to come over? And so our folks are sampling at high flow events to see under different conditions what comes over. And then the third piece is once it comes over, what effect is that going to have on the bay? How far down do those sediments, nitrogen, phosphorus, have in the bay? After they settle out, how much nitrogen, phosphorus is going to be released from the sediments, and how is that going to affect the algae that take it up, and will they sink and consume oxygen and create more of these dead zones? And so our scientists embarked on the study just this spring to answer those three questions. But really, no one's done the job that we're doing, taking these long cores and seeing what's accumulated over time, how old that material is, how reactive it is, and then it's kind of like those that show Storm Chasers. You know, when something happens, we're going to be sampling there in a reactive mode, kind of like a SWAT team. They're going to go out there. Where does that go? And they're going to follow to see what happens. You know, one thing that I think was interesting in this debate is that you know, many of our local counties said, well, why should we do anything about cleaning up our rivers until they clean up the Conowingo or solve this problem? And it's kind of like my mother said, is two wrongs don't make a right. I mean, we could go out here off the Horn Point Laboratory, we're in the Chop Tank, or Talbot County, you know, look at the Tread Avon. The Chop Tank absolutely has no effect on those rivers whatsoever. You can't trace the water, you can't trace the sediment. Everyone saw those dramatic photographs of the sediment coming in. That layer was maybe 2 or 3 feet thick, okay? That was the fresh water, and those sediments are right at the surface. They settled out, and it was a very local phenomenon. And so the main impact of the Conowingo on the Susquehanna is for that main part of the bay, is for the deep channel. Once it gets down below the Bay Bridge, it's hardly measurable. And so for citizens that are living on these tributaries, up the Chester and up the Tread Avon and up the Chop Tank, to say, well, we're not going to do anything about cleaning up our runoff, our local waters, it just was nonsensical to me, really. It's kind of kicking the can down the road. We're kind of like the blind lady of justice. I mean, we're not on the hook for anyone, from anything like this. And, you know, it took a while to get the contract, and through our administrative officials and legal advice. So, you know, we're not gagged in any way. Our data that we collect after a certain time is available to any of the public. So if you're a high school student doing a science project, or if you're a law student wanting to do a study, our data is freely available. And so, and it's a grant from Exelon with no strings attached. We're not employees of Exelon. Many times these utilities will hire a consulting company. So there it's a contract with them. But as an academic institution, we have the right to, we have the obligation to make all of our data publicly available. That's in our charter. And our scientists have the right to publish the data. And when they publish it, it has to go through peer review. So 2 or 3 people are checking the numbers to make sure it's right. And that's, I think, how we could stand on firm ground to say, this is what we found. So we're not under the gun from anyone to have one view or the other. It's just that this is what we found, and you interpret it as you will. In relatively short order being 6-9 months a year, the data on what's behind the dam in terms of how much sediment is stored there, how old is it, how much nitrogen, how much phosphorus, how reactive, that data will be analyzed, checked, rechecked, put into a database, and made available to the public, right? For how much comes over under different conditions, that might be tricky. I mean, are we going to have a tropical storm this summer? Are we going to have a hurricane? Is next winter going to have a high snowfall and then all of a sudden a melt and that big slug's going to come out there? So we can't predict Mother Nature. All we can do is essentially sample under the conditions that exist. And so that's a part that, could we predict the effect of a 100-year storm? Well, we'll measure it under X flow, 2 times X flow, and 5 times X flow, and would have to extrapolate to what that's going to be, because that's the only data that you have. Right. That. We'll try to simulate it and do a model, and so they'll have different sediment release under different flow conditions, but we won't have all flow conditions because they didn't exist under the period of study. So that's where the extrapolation and modeling will have to be. I think by nature most scientists are optimistic because they focus on the basic processes, and they could find times or other places where things have gotten better, and they want to carry that knowledge and enthusiasm to back to the local waters here. I often thought it was a good idea to essentially hit an area with everything like the Corsica a number of years ago, where Wayne Gilchrist said, we've got to upgrade that sewage treatment plant. And then the town of Centerville got a grant to control stormwater, and they did marsh restoration, and we did oyster restoration. And a number of our faculty have found that the water quality has improved in the Corsica. So if we know how to do this, we just have to have the public will to do this. And they don't happen overnight. You got to keep at it for a while.